Hello and welcome to this week's review, and I suppose it's a bit like that old saying, isn't it, where you're waiting around for a bus for ages and ages and then 3 turn up all at once. And it's the same with platter mats, which of course go together, don't they, buses and platter mats? You can be waiting around for a platter mat review for months and months, and then 2 turn up in a couple of weeks, which is what's happened here. It was only a week or 2 ago I reviewed the Soundeck PM Platter Mat. I'll put a little link up yonder if you want to have a look at that. And now we've got another one. In fact, the Hexmat Eclipse, shaped in a rather hexagonal fashion, is priced in terms of pounds, I would say £236. As far as euros are concerned, 280. And as for dollars, 324, but you're talking about my conversion software, so it might not be absolutely exact, but there or thereabouts. Now, why would you want to even upgrade your platter mat? Surely the manufacturer of the turntable knows best on that score. Well, that's not actually really the case, and I talked about this. I talked about why it's necessary, or rather desirable, to upgrade your platter mat in an earlier Hexmat review. That was a Hexmat platter mat called the Yellow Bird, and I did that review be about a year, no, more than a year. I think it was a year last June, so a year and a few months. What I will do, I'll put a link for the Yellow Bird review up here. If you want to hear my thoughts on why I think platter mats are ripe for upgrading, check out the first part of this video, and it sort of talks about the background as to why I feel platter mats get, well, as I said in that particular video, short shrift, and also why platter mats are really second-class accessories in terms of the manufacturer's build budgets. It's all discussed in that link, so check out that. I don't want to repeat myself here. This video is going to be long enough as it is, so if you want to know a little bit of that background as to why I think platter mats are upgradable in the first place, then please check out that link. It'll tell you more about my thoughts on the matter. Now, when I reviewed the Yellow Bird from Hexmat, this was the first time and I suspect many other people, had even heard of the company and its unusually designed platter mat. What looked like a novelty certainly was anything but in play. The sonic enhancements that the Yellow Bird brought to the overall turntable performance was significant indeed. In fact, the Yellow Bird quickly became my high-end reference mat, and it's lived on my Origin Live Sovereign since that time. Its status as an all-conquering design is under threat, however, and from Hexmat itself, with the company's newly released Eclipse platter mat. Now, this is the Hexmat Yellow Bird, and you can see it's a rather eccentric looking piece of apparatus with its hexagonal shape and its bold yellow colouring. And this is the new Eclipse, again retaining that same shape, as you can see, rather demure in its black approach, but there's a little bit of see-through polymer peeking out from underneath that black top layer. Let me bring both to camera just so you can see the differences a little bit closer at hand. Okay, there is the Yellow Bird, and if you've bought one of these, you're obviously very familiar with it. As I say, it has that unique, well, it was unique shape. The flip side of this particular mat, well, it basically repeats what you can see here, so there's no real difference. That's not the same with the new Eclipse though. There is the new Eclipse a little bit closer to you, and if we flip over to the rear, you've got a nice little Hexmat design. Now, I did ask Hexmat if there's an up or down, that is, which way do you put this thing on your turntable? and Hexmat confirmed there is no up or down. It works well either way, so decide which side is more appealing to you and, well, enjoy your records. So what is the Eclipse and how does it presume to improve on the Yellowbird? Both the Yellowbird and the Eclipse was designed by a gentleman from Hungary. I think they're based in Budapest, is Hexmat. Budapest in Hungary. Gentleman's name is, get this pronunciation correct, Jolt Fate. I think it's Jolt Fate. It's not spelt like that. I'll put the spelling below so you can see it for yourself. And I made the mistake in the Yellowbird review of massacring the poor man's name. But I think it's Jolt Fate. The basic philosophy of the Eclipse is to move away from mass. It's to move away from damping and over damping. It's to turn instead towards isolation and decoupling. So when you put an Eclipse on your platter, if you look at the side, what you will see is that the mat hardly touches the platter at all. There are little dimples, nipples? Can I say that on YouTube? Nipples? Maybe not. Bobbly bits. Try bobbly bits. That's probably less offensive to the YouTube algorithm. So what you will see with the Eclipse is a limited number of these bobbly bits slightly raising the mat off the platter. So in effect, what you have is a grand total, if you add up all those bobbly bits together, I think it's a grand total of between 1 and 2 square millimeters actually touching the platter. Now, if you put your record on top of the Eclipse, well, it's the same thing because the bobbly bits stretch below but also above, and the bobbly bits themselves touch the record in the same manner. So you will get between 1 and 2 square millimeters of mat touching the record it's supporting. So let me use the Yellowbird first as a comparison, because the bobbly bits on the Yellowbird are a little bit more prominent, maybe a little bit more easy to see than the Eclipse. I'll show you the Eclipse in a second, but the Yellowbird, well, let me just take this to camera. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it or whether it'll just blur out, but let's give this a go. So what you can see here, you can see these bobbly bits here. If you can see them, they're slightly darker than the rest of the mat. And they're the things that support the record. And at the same time, the platter supports this mat in the same way, because on the rear, again, you can see little bobbly bits here. Now let's see if I can get you a cross section here. I don't know if you can just make out 1 or 2 of those bobbly bits and how, there you are. Can you see that? The actual mat here is there's a little bit of give, a little bit of flexibility. Now the Eclipse is not quite like that, and these bobbly bits are not the same either. They've been modified a little bit. Let me show you that. Now where the Yellowbird's bobbly bits were solid and protruding, the Eclipse, well, the Eclipse sort of inserts those bobbly bits into little holes. You can see the light shining. I'm moving my hand behind the Eclipse here just to emphasize the point. You can see the holes in the actual mat itself. The bobbly bits have been inserted within each and every hole. That means they don't protrude as much. So if I do this, it's difficult to see. It's difficult, isn't it? Because of it's wanting to focus on the records behind here. How about that? It's not great. Anyway, well, they don't really stick out as much. That's what I'm desperately trying to say here, those bobbly bits. So they're more inset, they're more fitted inside each of these holes. That means that the isolation is still retained, but the mat is not pushed away as far from the platter, and the record is not pushed away as far from the mat. Also notice this central hole, this rather strange shape. It doesn't actually make any difference in play, I might add. Anyway, enough of the bobbly bits. Let's get back to the overall design. The other notable change you'll see for the Eclipse is it's a lot stiffer. I'm actually trying to bend it. I don't want to bend it too much, don't want to break this thing. But there is a little bit of flex in the Eclipse, not much, nowhere near what you will find with the Yellowbird. The Eclipse here is rather more rigid in its design than the Yellowbird. When you put the Eclipse on the platter itself, you will notice that the Eclipse itself, the actual physicality of the mat, is slightly thicker than the Yellowbird. So the Yellowbird in itself is about 1 millimeter thick. The Eclipse, I would say, is about 2 millimeters. Now, as a trade-off, the Yellowbird's bobbly bits protrude more than the Eclipse. So those bobbly bits actually add to the overall thickness, the usable thickness. So if you measure the little bobbly bits either side of the central Yellowbird mat, the actual thickness is somewhere around 3 millimeters. So that's 1 millimeter for each bobbly bit and 1 millimeter for the central mat. For the Eclipse, while those bobbly bits don't protrude as much, probably 0.5 millimeter, if that. So the overall thickness when you add the central core mat and those protruding bobbly bits is, well, around 3 millimeters, maybe a tad more, maybe 3.5 millimeters in total. But the difference, well, it's negligible, I would say. So in effect, if you have a Yellowbird and you want to upgrade to the Eclipse, you could probably get away with not changing the VTA of your tone arm. And that is something you need to think about when you're buying Hexmat platter mats of whatever type. You will need to change the VTA of your tone arm. That is, you will have to raise the height of the tone arm. If your turntable cannot do this, then I would not recommend buying a Hexmat platter mat. If you don't change the VTA of your tone arm, the tone arm itself will be playing a record at an angle. Ideally, what you want is your tone arm to be dead level. If the platter mat is higher, it's going to push the stylus upwards, and having a stylus play a record at a bit of a dodgy angle will cause distortions of some type. So if you don't alter this so-called vertical tracking angle, the VTA, which lowers and raises the height of your tone arm, you get distortions in the sound. The sound will probably sound a little bit bright, a bit edgy. So think carefully about buying a Hexmat. If your turntable's arm does not have a VTA adjustment, then don't go there. I would actually recommend something very thin, something like an Origin Live turntable platter mat would be the one I would go for, because it is very thin and sounds wonderful for the price, and that price is about £43. We're going to have a look at the Origin Live platter mat in a moment during the sound tests, but if your turntable doesn't have VTA adjustment, the Origin Live is probably the best mat to go for under those circumstances. For everyone else, well, the Eclipse is an option. The Eclipse design is based upon a bespoke extruded polymer to enhance sound quality. That hexagonal shape is actually cut by a laser. Other bespoke tools have been included to individually insert those isolating spheres, those so-called bobbly bits. Yes, those bobbly bits are individually wrapped, as it were, and they are individually separately inserted. Also, every single mat is hand-checked before shipping. To confirm this mat is fine if using 12-inch discs albums, or 10-inch albums or EPs, or 7-inch singles. They all work well. The Eclipse itself, according to the company, has anti-magnetic properties and also offers low static capabilities. And yes, you can use the Eclipse with a clamp or a stabilizer. In fact, during the tests, I myself used the Eclipse with an Origin Live Gravity. So how does the Eclipse actually sound, and how does it compare to the competition? Let's check those sound tests and we'll find out. For the sound tests, I grabbed a copy of Ella Fitzgerald's album of spiritual music on the Capitol label called Brighten the Corner, and played the track I Shall Not Be Moved. This one features a close harmony backing group, percussion, upright bass, cymbal taps and piano. A goodly selection of frequency challenges for our mats here. Now I'm going to be gauging the sound quality of the Eclipse by comparing this particular Hexmat Eclipse with a range of other mats, and we'll go through them one at a time. Let me reassure you that I did change the VTA on my tone arm for each and every mat, so at all times my tone arm was level. Now I did the actual tests on my reference Origin Live Sovereign turntable. That's being used currently for a different review, a different set of tests. So what I've done, I've brought in my Project Evo just to use as a sort of fashion model, just to show the mats in action, but I didn't use the Evo for the actual sound tests. So how does the Eclipse compare to the competition? Well, let me say this first. As we're talking high end here in Platter Mat terms, I don't want to dwell too much on the budget selections here. Suffice to say, after quick tests, the Hexmat was superior to the felt mat at about £12, the leather mat at around £20, and the cork mat priced around £18 across the entire frequency spectrum. I especially liked the felt and cork mats in their price points and recommend both for users on a low budget. The leather example did suffer from mid-range roll-off, resulting in a slight warming in the upper mid-range area. So personally, well, I would avoid the leather mat if you're after balanced output. I really wanted to spend more time on the higher end platter mat just to give the Eclipse a stiffer test, and oddly enough, that's what most of these mats were. They were all rigid, except the Origin Live, which is a floppy, but everything else was rigid, and that's intriguing. I find that higher end platter mats tend to be rigid. Not sure why that is, but that's the case. So on that basis, I dragged in a selection of my favourite competing mats to throw up against the Eclipse in this review. Now I've collated this bunch of platter mat designs over the years, and I highly recommend each and every one of them. In their own price points, each of the mats you're about to see in this test worked very well indeed. So I suppose you could say that this particular review is also a bit of a pseudo buyer's guide. In terms of price, assume the more expensive models are superior because, noting my past tests for platter mats, that's how this particular batch of mats seemed to land. The performance, at least with these platter mats, in general terms, follows price. So to begin, I first picked up the Origin Live platter mat. Now, during general play, I did notice with this Ella Fitzgerald track that Fitzgerald's delivery was a little bit spiky. It had a little bit of, well, the mid-range was slightly elevated, shall we say. A little bit edgy, not particularly bright. Well, maybe a little bit during crescendos. Now, the felt mat and the cork mat did address that to a degree, but the majority of that upper mid-range highlight was still there. The Origin Live mat did decrease that a lot, and that was a really nice effect. It did calm the edgy Fitzgerald vocal quite a bit, a good thing. Swapping the Origin Live mat for the Eclipse, that edginess was gone. Totally gone. Fitzgerald, in fact, relaxed into the mix for the first time so that you could hear some space around the delivery. The lady herself resumed her trademark, softly delivered, smooth presentation, which meant that the song sounded at ease. In terms of instrumentation, both the upright bass and the piano, facing each other on the left and right channels, sounded much larger from the Eclipse. The physical size of both appeared to grow. The upright bass on the right channel, that retained its personality. Yes, it had those string bending effects during play, but the massy nature of the upright bass was better represented now, I would say. The piano on the left channel seemed to be a bigger box than before. With the Eclipse, it growled during its bassy tones, and the upper mid and treble notes, well, they tend to float a little bit more in and around more air and space. I also noticed how much more focused the close harmony singers were now. Their own vocal work was now more nimble, but also more accurate in its approach. So yes, in comparison to the Origin Live, the Eclipse was a noticeable improvement. And the Origin Live, as I said before, is priced around £43 or so. The next two mats, both the Achromat and the Soundeck PM Platter Mat, well, I wanted to review those together because they occupy a very similar price point, somewhere around £85–90 or so. Let's start with the Achromat, which did handle the edgy nature of the Fitzgerald presentation in a more confident manner than the Origin Live mat, but it didn't have the super smooth performance of the Eclipse. There was a swathe of upper mid-range control emanating from the Achromat, and it performed wonderfully for the price, but the Eclipse settled these upper mid-range stormy waters, I would say, more successfully. The Achromat still featured some elements of stress and tension in the Fitzgerald lead vocal delivery, which the Eclipse totally removed. These same comments could be thrown at the backing close harmony group. Their individual voices were recognisable and were well presented on the Achromat, but not quite with the same level of focus or accuracy as heard from the Eclipse. In bass terms, the Achromat tracked both the piano and the upright bass very well indeed, and there were lots of detail from both instruments. Again though, the Eclipse just seemed to go further. It just seemed to produce more information from the bass regions. It added a better tonal balance overall, I would say. So what of the Soundeck Platter Mat recently reviewed on this site? The Soundeck proved to be the flip side of the Achromat in that it performed well around the upper frequencies, offering good discipline and focus, but it tended to excel in the lower end, giving control in the bass regions with added presence for both piano and upright bass, while the Fitzgerald vocal and close harmonies were handled and controlled well with a good level of precision that exceeded the Achromat in these areas. The Soundeck did not sound as expansive as the Achromat in the upper mid-range frequencies, with treble not flying quite as high there either. So if I could generalize and vastly simplify what the Achromat and the Soundeck and the Eclipse give you, it's this. In its price point, the Achromat is best in the upper frequencies. It does bass very well, it's very nice, there's nothing wrong with bass, but it really excels in the upper frequencies. For the Soundeck, well, the Soundeck is the other way around. The Soundeck does very nicely with those upper frequencies, treble, mid-range, very nice indeed, but it excels in the bass. That's where it really wins out. So you've got the Achromat really doing wonderfully well in the upper frequencies, the Soundeck doing wonderfully well in the bass frequencies, and the Eclipse, well, the Eclipse does very well on both sides, the upper and lower frequencies, but it also pushes further on. So with the Eclipse takes the best from the Achromat and the best from the Soundeck and then moves those sound qualities on a few pegs. Now again, let's not forget the price here. The Achromat and the Soundeck are wonderful mats on their own, as I've already said, but both are around £90 each. The Eclipse is over £200, so you would expect the Eclipse to do well. However, it's quite reassuring when you do hear that proof, when you do hear those sonic differences. So what of Hexmat's own Yellowbird? Where does that fit into all of this? How does that rate in terms of sound when compared to the Eclipse? Now, the last time I looked, the Yellowbird was priced around somewhere around €140, and let's not forget that the Eclipse is twice that price, which is quite a hunk of change. Now, before this review, the Yellowbird, to my ears, was the best platter mat I had ever heard. So the Eclipse was really going to have to go some to better the Yellowbird, in my opinion. To get to the point straight away, the Eclipse begins at the Yellowbird point in sonic terms and then moves on from there. So how can you describe the overall sound envelope of the Eclipse when compared to the Yellowbird? When you're comparing the two, I wouldn't say the Eclipse adds more bass. I wouldn't say the Eclipse adds more mid-range or more dynamic reach. I would say the Yellowbird has all of those basics in place already. It already does those things right. It does them correctly. So what does the Eclipse actually do then? What does it bring to the party? And this statement needs lots of explanation. The Eclipse lowers the noise floor. As I say though, there's lots to talk about under that simple statement. To begin, Fitzgerald's vocal finally fully relaxes into the song. Gone is the tension and gone is the stress. The Yellowbird also removes that tension and stress. Now, while the Yellowbird reduces the tension and the stress from the Fitzgerald vocal, the Eclipse goes further by also relaxing the frequencies around her. Everything else around the Fitzgerald vocal is de-stressed. That is, the Eclipse expands the low noise, low tension effect right across the central stereo image. This meant that the lead vocal offered more nuance and emotion, as did the close harmony backing, which now revealed more vocal tricks in the melange of vocal noise. The clarity was vastly increased here, so if a close harmony vocal member added a little vocal twiddle here or there in the vocal chords, then the Eclipse picked it up, which gave this area far more complexity and richness. Now, I have heard people who have listened to the Eclipse say that the soundstage was stretched left and right, that the soundstage was enlarged, there was more of it. And I would disagree. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that's an illusion, and the reason I say that is because what you're actually hearing, again, is a lowering of the noise floor. So the soundstage doesn't actually move in terms of its size. It remains quite broad as is, but it's decluttered. You're actually removing a lot of the rubbish, so you can hear more from the soundstage. If you sweep your ear left and right, you can hear more detail. That sounds like the soundstage has been stretched, but it's not the case. You're just hearing more of what's already there, which in itself is a great thing. Now, later on, as this track builds to a climax, there's a host of cymbal taps, and the cymbal taps with the Eclipse, well, they now added reverb tails, extended reverb tails, or echo effects, if you will. The fragility of the treble around the cymbals was enhanced. It became more ethereal, more fragile, and those echo reverb tails extended further with the Eclipse in place. In short then, the difference between the Eclipse and the Yellowbird is this. So imagine you're watching a television, and imagine you're seeing a man walking down a road. The Yellowbird gives you a standard definition picture of that content. The Eclipse doesn't change the content. You still see the same guy, it's the same road, it's the same motion. There is no change in the actual content. But the Eclipse gives you a high definition picture of that content. And that's the difference. That's what the Eclipse is giving you. The Yellowbird is giving you standard definition sound. The Eclipse gives you high def sound. That's the difference. The lower noise floor produces more information, it produces more emotion, it produces more clarity, it gives you better transparency. That's what the Eclipse gives you. So, how do I conclude the review of the Hexmat Eclipse Platter Mat? Well, if ever a hi-fi test proves the point that everything matters in sound quality terms, at least to my ears, then this is it. The A/B tests here ran straight and true. Performance, as I say, followed price right along the line. Now that's possibly because I brought in a bunch of my favourite platter mats, and each platter mat excelled at its own price point. That could have had something to do with it. But nevertheless, that was what I was hearing. What did surprise me though was that the Hexmat Eclipse, a fascinating piece of hi-fi technology all on its own, could move the performance ceiling higher still. I have to say that platter mat technology is a much maligned and much neglected area. It's about time that a company out there really pushed the boundaries and went all out to make a great platter mat. It's an accessory that is all too often ignored. Hexmat with the Eclipse, also the Yellowbird, but especially with the Eclipse, well, they've put that to rights. Hexmat's application, its design, its research into the technology, well, it's to be highly commended. Hexmat has really got its teeth into the issues here and produced a design, a product that really impresses. The Eclipse is an incredible accessory. There's no doubt here. The Eclipse is the best platter mat I have ever heard. On those terms, it is best in class. And I find it very easy to say that if you want your turntable to work at the very peak of its potential performance, you need to take a very close look at the Hexmat Eclipse. And that's it, folks. Thank you very much for staying to the end of the video, and thank you too for your support. If I could ask you to click on the like and also subscribe buttons below, down yonder there, then I would be chuffed to bits. Thank you very much again. Check the description below. It has a whole host of social media links, links to my website. Also, I'm on Patreon, and if you can support me on Patreon, that would be excellent. There's some exclusive material on there if you'd like to check that out. And also there are chapter headings in the description if you'd like to navigate around this video. That will help you. And I'll be back with another video next week. I hope you can join me because I like to have your company. Until that time, folks, bye bye for now.